Well, the biggest misconception is that it's a religion right from the get-go, because it's much more than that. Now, people say, oh, it's not a religion, it's a way of life, but it's much more than a way of life as well. It's a way of thinking, it's a way of being. It's multidisciplinary, as you would say in academic terms. Now, if they're not studying Indian philosophy and Hinduism and these things in India, then who's going to take it seriously? The Mahabharata is a treatise about Dharma, Bharata, the principle behind all Dharma. That's the main principle from which all other principles of Dharma come. If you look at the teachings of most world religions, it's bizarre, without doubt. My legal name is Shaunaka Rishi. So sometimes I get invited I get invited by a university in India, and I'll go and I'll walk out, they'll introduce me, and everyone looks at me. Knowledge in itself is a passport. If you actually know what you're talking about, more than know what you talk about, if you embody what you talk about, then people get it. So you're connecting with them intellectually, but also at a certain level, you're connecting heart to heart. To be a loving person, to be a loving friend, just seems our ego, our selfish desires get in the way so often. We end up in conflict with people. We end up having arguments and falling out.
Welcome back to the show. Now, it's been quite an interesting journey so far. For those of you who have been following episode by episode and all the variety of shows, we've taken on a deep dive into the ideas around identity. What does it all mean, especially when you see things such as global conflict? Now, my team were meticulously going through the internet archives, and they came across an incredible organization at Oxford University, which teaches about Hinduism. And so they reached out to the dean himself, Shaunaka Rishi, to find out more about what they're doing and why does it matter. So without further ado, I'm very privileged to have Shaunaka on the platform today via Zoom itself. Hopefully next time we'll be face to face as well, to run me through what they're doing at Oxford University and to help me make sense of the world at large. So without further ado, Shaunaka, it's lovely to have you on.
Thank you, Rajan. Thank you very much. You're kind. Yes, so what we do, we started this endeavor about 28 years ago. The Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies is a separate institution to Oxford University, but we do provide all the teaching and supervision to the university for Hindu studies. So it's there's an umbilical relationship, you could call it, I suppose. And that's important to us because our kind of primary principle is that everything we do is not sectarian or political. So it's not a center for it's not a Hindu center, it's a center for Hindu studies at that academic level. We didn't realize when we started that we were the first such center of its kind in the world. They don't do these studies in India, or they haven't until the last year or so. They've started to develop Hindu studies programs, and we're helping with that development from here. So we did take on the responsibility of doing this as to make it as rigorous as possible, because we were developing the benchmark. So the center has become the leading center in the world in the field. And why is that important? I mean, Hindu studies. So the first phone call I had practically in the center, a young chap from London came up. He was doing an open day in Oxford. He bumped into us kind of by accident. He thought, this is great. He was a young Shah, was his name. And he thought, this is brilliant. Oh, this is what I want to do. And then the next day I had a telephone call from his mother saying, what will my child do? How will he get a job? Will I be supporting him all his life? So, and of course, she had no idea that people do get academic jobs in the field and they get paid actual money. And but not only that, of course, with Oxford and Cambridge, you get an undergraduate degree. And one of our girls, Patel girl, did 3 years of Sanskrit, only Sanskrit, walked straight into Goldman Sachs. Why? Well, it's an Oxford degree. It's like she's a highly educated person. And the fact that she chose Sanskrit is actually interesting for Goldman Sachs or PricewaterhouseCoopers or EY, because, here's a thinking person. She thinks outside the box. They can train her for 15 weeks to do what they want her to do, and she'll walk in at a good level. So that having to explain that to people, but we understood immediately the difficulty was, it's exactly your question. What's the point of all this? Why would you do Hindu studies? And one of the reasons is we we're all born into a certain circumstance. We get our culture from our education, the education that has developed in that circumstance historically and religiously. And it could be in America, it could be in England, it could be anywhere, but who takes Indian culture seriously? Now, if they're not studying Indian philosophy and Hinduism and these things in India, then who's going to take it seriously? And why would they take it seriously? And if you don't study these things, then young people think in India, what's the value of it? If no one's putting energy into it, if no one's taking it seriously, well, I won't take it seriously. Well, what are you taking seriously? Engineering, medicine, computer science, and that's what they're going to do. And if that's what all the exams lead towards. And so there's training to pass exams, but is that education? Does that help them think differently? And because of this lack of education in the field, people have lost contact with Indian intellectual culture, heritage. And it's one of the most interesting intellectual heritages on the planet. And how are we supposed to know about it if no one cares about it, if no one educates about it? So in a global context, we're having all these tariff wars now that shows that globalization has been working for some time in the field of politics and economics, because once you start talking about tariffs, it starts to impact all of that. But it hasn't worked successfully, or I don't know if we've even really tried to start in the field of intellectual discourse or spiritual discourse. And because of that, Indian culture hasn't been taken seriously. So it's not part of the global discourse. So is the global discourse truly global? And
how interesting.
By doing this study, we're looking at Hindu studies and saying, is there something here that's worth studying? We're doing it from a dispassionate, critical perspective. So we're not saying Hindu studies worth studying, we have to study Hindu studies. We're looking at the texts and saying, here's something interesting, here's something interesting. If we don't find anything, then there's nothing interesting. It's as simple as that. But we've been going for 28 years, so there must be something.
There must be something there. I was going to say, what is the biggest misconception then that people have when you think of a religion like Hinduism from the outside in?
Well, the biggest misconception is that it's a religion. So it's right from the get-go, because it's much more than that. Now, people say, "Oh, it's not a religion; it's a way of life," but it's much more than a way of life as well. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of being. It's multidisciplinary, as you would say in academic terms. So it's religion, it's philosophy, it's culture, it's arts, aesthetics, drama, poetry, it's architecture, it's economics, it's politics. It's all of these subjects. So if it's legal. In the legal realm. Let me give you an example of the legal realm. Yeah. So the Vedantic idea that we are, there's spiritual energy and material energy, and we are part of the spiritual energy, and we're embodied in this world. So the Atman, the idea of the spiritual self. So this spiritual self goes from body to body, has that capacity, or it can leave the material realm and be free, be liberated, moksha. So that's a Vedantic idea. So if that's a philosophical idea, that's great. Now let's go back a few hundred years to Europe in the 1700s. The Enlightenment is happening. People are questioning how we think about things and how we think about the basis of the law. The basis in up to that point, the self was considered to be sacred. It was considered to be part of God, and that was a legal proposition. So they decided, well, let's separate religion and the law. So then the basis of law is that of human dignity. Sounds great. So we run with that, and we develop human rights declarations and etc. And that's been the trajectory. But let's go back to Vedanta. If the basis of our thinking is that we are not material but spiritual, and this Atma is the very energy of life itself. This energy is spiritual, but it's the same energy that I have, that an elephant has, and a crocodile, and a Dalit and a Brahmin. So yeah, it's the same energy. So namaste means I offer my respect to the spiritual, the eternal within you. So I can do that to any living being. So therefore, the basis of law, according to that in Indian heritage, a discourse could happen, that the basis of law is not human dignity, which could be seen then as speciesist.
Yeah.
And it's the basis isn't human dignity, but the dignity of all life. Now, if that was the basis of law, then you couldn't encroach on the habitat of a lion or an elephant, or you couldn't encroach on the habitat of a crocodile. So that species wouldn't be harmed, wouldn't be endangered as they are, the tigers. So you put into the legal system that all forms of life have rights. And then how do you develop environmental policy based on that? How do you develop social policy based on that? It has a huge impact on how society operates, how people think. So this is a challenge from Indian heritage directly to the basis of legal thinking, legal philosophy, shall we say. Who's discussing this? This is global thinking. This is now looking at something that developed in Western Europe in the 1700s and something that developed in India some thousands of years ago that haven't been in discourse with each other. So therefore, it's the basis of the legal system of India has been inherited from this Enlightenment thinking from Europe through England uncritically. And it's said to be, this is a sensible system. It is a sensible system, but is it sensible for India? Is it sensible for India according to Indian heritage and culture? Now, if people want to disregard Indian heritage and culture, fine, it's a great system. But if they want to include Indian heritage and culture, there might need to be a further discussion. So that's a very, very simple example of how deep this can get, how challenging this can get. But actually, the challenge is so positive in regard to the issue of the environment, which is the issue of the day, the issue of young people. It mightn't be our generation, but it's the issue of young people.
Speak for yourself. Yeah, but you're right. But you're right, though. It is an issue of the day. So please continue, because this is absolutely fascinating. It is an issue of the day because people right now are looking for a deeper understanding to the perspectives of what identity means, and therefore what is currently identifiable. If it isn't in line with what the critical thinking of those regions are, then we have to ask ourselves deeper questions. Okay, I have to ask a question now then. We're in a sphere of conflict that we're seeing taking shape across the globe. Okay, so the question is, we're in a time of conflict at this moment in time, and you're saying that this is a system of belief. It goes much deeper because it has a look at the spiritual elements. Then in accordance to Hindu studies, how is conflict seen? How is conflict dealt with?
Well, so it's interesting. If we go into the Mahabharata and Gita, so the Mahabharata, we say that the Mahabharata is about a war, a fratricidal war, but that's only up to the 6th chapter. There are 18, but as a film version, you're going to focus on the war and all the politics around it because that makes sense for visuals. Our discussions, that's not going to make it to the TV. It's also not going to make it into the abridged edition because there's 18 books. The abridged edition has to be 1. So a lot of people don't get to this discourse in the Mahabharata. They just look at the war, and then the question that comes up, well, why is Krishna counseling Arjuna to fight a war, as it seems he is? But that's actually not what's happening, because the Bhagavad Gita is only one chapter of the bigger book. You have to see the context. And most of the discussion, not harming. It's not anti-war. It's how to lead a life that doesn't harm others. Now, Yudhisthira, the emperor, the person who is on one side of the war, he goes out of his way not to fight. It's actually frustrating when you read the story, because they tried to burn them. They exiled them. They tried to rape his wife. They cheat in at dice. They do everything. And at every stage, you think, okay, now is the time. The Liam Neeson time, where he rings up and he says, I
I
have
don't.
skills. I will find you. You're hoping that's what happens immediately. Let's get the guy. Let's break his legs. I'll smash him. And Eustace says no, and then something else, and Eustace says no, and you become quite frustrated. What's he doing? He doesn't want to fight. He doesn't think it's right. He doesn't think it's. But there is a certain point at which, yeah, you have to. So he got to that point. At the end of the story, he becomes the hero, the chap who didn't want to fight. But when he fought, he won. But he just chose the right time. But he acted based on minimizing harm. If you can get away with not fighting, you don't. That's the thing to do. So it's a very interesting discourse. So Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita starts with the conch shells blowing, which means the war has started irrevocably. And then Arjuna has his breakdown and turns to Krishna and says, help me. So in that context, then Krishna is saying, well, you have to fight. You don't have much choice. I mean, look around. How are you physically going to get off the battlefield without fighting? So, and beforehand, of course, Krishna has gone around to the main protagonists and asked them not to fight. So he himself has gone around. The Mahabharata is a treatise about Dharma. Mahabharata, the principle behind all Dharma. That's the main principle from which all other principles of Dharma come. That's the message of the Mahabharata as regard to Dharma. And it's also a story about Avatar, that the Avatar is Krishna. But interestingly, only 4 people in the Mahabharata recognize Krishna as God. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was God, I'd be coming down and I'd come and say, oh, and by the way, I'm God.
Here I am.
I'd make sure everyone knew. But Krishna, he has more self-esteem because he's God. He doesn't have an ego like we do, so he doesn't need to do that. So it's interesting that he goes around as God, gives people the opportunity to choose, and in the Gita gives Arjuna the opportunity to choose what he wants to do. At the end says, think about what I said fully, and then do as you wish to do. Icha, do as you desire. So he gives him that opportunity, and it's such an interesting way of acting. He says you have to desire to do this. You have to desire the right thing. I can come and tell you to do it. I am God, you will do this. That could be just the basis of the Mahabharata. He turns to him, asks for help, and he says, do this, this, this. I'm God, do it. End of story. And you could think from one point of view, well, that would be kind to him, to solve his problem for him. But Krishna says, no, you have to choose. It has to be your desire. You have to do. So that spiritual discourse is not dogmatic. That's such an important message of this whole thing, that ahimsa has to be something that comes from us individually, not imposed. It's not a rule that we have to follow in every circumstance. In fact, as in Yudhishthira's case, there are circumstances when you do have to fight. It's just how you do it, how you get to that point. So it's a very interesting discourse, as you say, about conflict. Conflict will happen. Why? Because Duryodhana wanted it to happen. His desire, his choice was war. So the discussion before the battle, Yudhishthira is speaking and explaining that he's born into a Kshatriya family, but he really doesn't enjoy being a Kshatriya, because he says the dharma of Kshatriya is like dogs barking, just ruff, 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 and then it just escalates into violence, and he really doesn't like it. Kshatriya, so I have to stay here and do my duty. Duryodhana is having a conversation before the war, and he says, I'm a Kshatriya, therefore I will get what I want by any means. And that's Machiavellianism, but actually it's Duryodhanism because he came before Machiavelli. So Machiavelli was a Duryodhan. So Duryodhana, he comes out and he says, by any means possible, I get what I want. Completely different thinking to Yudhisthira. So where's the anger and greed and lust? And they're the three things that are identified in the Gita as the cause of all this. So where does conflict come from? Comes from there. So as long as someone wants something that someone else has, there's going to be conflict. You can't avoid it. So the peacenik option doesn't work. You can't just say peace, 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 we want peace. Yes, we want peace in this circumstance at this time. But you know that sometimes there's going to be war. Why? Because another person's going to come and say, I want your stuff. Give me your stuff. I don't want to give your stuff. Ukraine, Gaza, any conflict we look at, that's exactly what seems a little simplistic, but it is simplistic. It's nearly like a 4-year-old saying, give me I want that. You can't have it. No, I want that. And they get angry and they throw a tantrum, and it's a whole thing.
It's the principles. That's what you're saying.
It's the principles. Understanding the problem comes from within ourselves, and we're all involved on some level with conflict, as long as we're not consciously trying to control ourselves, because our principle isn't ahimsa.
Yeah.
Or, ahimsa is the Sanskrit term for making harm less. But in every tradition, you're going to find a similar term, a similar thing. But in the Mahabharata, it's very interesting. It's a discourse of 120,000 verses, 6 times longer than the Iliad and Odyssey put together. So it's a big discourse. And the main message is the principle behind all Dharma is not harming.
Shaunaka, you've been doing this for over 25 years in where you are, Oxford. What have you learned about yourself during this odyssey of self-discovery?
Well, it has been a lot more than 25 years, but in the Oxford context.
In the Oxford context.
About myself, it's a continuum. It's the same thing. If I self-reflect, and maybe this isn't the depth of answer you're looking for, but I see a lack of humility, a lack of compassion, a lack of tolerance, because they're the things I'm looking for. That's the person I would like to be. And as soon as you start trying for that, looking at those virtues, then the first thing you realize is how much you don't have them, and that realization kind of deepens. But I must also say on the other side that I've in consciously meditating on those principles and constantly meditating on the principles, then I have seen change, and I've been very surprised at that change, because there's a real difficulty trying to be good. It seems very elusive. It seems to be a loving person, to be a loving husband, to be a loving uncle, to be a loving friend. It just seems our ego, our selfish desires get in the way so often. We end up in conflict with people. We end up having arguments and falling out. And then when you examine it 10 years later, it looks so stupid and so infantile, because it was. So I look at myself in my teenage years, from when I was 25, even I looked at my teenage years and I thought that was a little pathetic. And then at 35, looking at my 25 years and thinking, I'm so much more realized now. And then I'm 45, looking at 35, thinking, oh God, what was I thinking?
What on earth is happening? Absolutely.
So every decade it just gets.
Well, what is the purpose of life?
But interestingly,
No, please.
What's the purpose of life? Yeah, the purpose of life for me is to know, love, and serve God, and by doing that journey, I'm getting to know, love, and serve everything connected with God, which is everything and everyone. So and I get that inspiration from books like the Bhagavad Gita and the Srimad Bhagavatam and other books, the Upanishads, but also from the Bible. I was brought up a Catholic in Ireland, and it's a very interesting book. I found it so then, and that's ironically that's what led me to Hinduism. Obviously, I took a wrong turn somewhere, but the word Catholic means universal, so maybe I didn't. So
Yeah.
so yeah, so the meaning of life for me is to have that purpose, to have a real purpose in life. Don't be thoughtless, become more thoughtful. And to be thoughtless is to say, okay, physics says that all atoms are created there's no meaning involved, that they're just created, they're just there. So therefore there's no meaning in life. And people come to very lazy intellectual conclusions, because we all look for meaning. So even if you think like that scientifically, you need to have a meaning. It's an inherent part of our metabolism, but it's not physics. Physics is just a material analysis of the world. So I was looking for more meaning, more purpose in my life, and I thought, what's the most purposeful thing is to find love. I mean, every Hollywood film is ultimately about love. Every record, every piece of literature, we're so absorbed in this, in every culture in the world, we're so absorbed in this need for love, to love and be loved. So even as a teenager, I got that. I understood it. And it's the main message of the Bible that I was reading. So so how do you find that? What is it? Where do you find it? And I just think that's the quest. For me, that's the quest. So how do you find love? How do you express that love to others? How do you think like that? How do you feel like that? And from all the reading I did from all the different cultures, the repository of love was in the Supreme, by whatever name we call the Supreme, that energy of love that is behind everything. So if I can connect with the purest, the source of love, then I have something to share. Then I have something. If I can have that relationship, then how much more can I have a relationship with anyone and everything? Otherwise, I'm attending a church, a synagogue, a mosque, and I'm bowing down for mercy, be kind to me, all that. But I turn around immediately, not kind to the person beside me.
Yeah.
Who's that? What kind of person is that? So how do I get that kind of taste for being selfless without thinking about it? It's not a discussion. It's not something I have to think about, and it's not something that I expect a reward for. And I did a selfless thing. Oh, God, I just want you to know I did a selfless thing. My wife, I need you to know I did a selfless thing. My workmates, you should know. That,
You should know. Look at my star chart. I've already got 5 stars out of 7. No, I fully understand. I fully understand. It's almost understanding the very magnitude of what makes us human, and it does boil down to love. It does feel like almost a Mills and Boone type book, but it's deeper though. It's not about the flesh. It's about something that essentially is the unseen and unconscious, but connects us all as human beings. When you tell people that, Shaunaka Rishi, who was from Ireland, who now teaches Hindu studies in Oxford University, what are some of the looks that you normally receive? And I think you know what I'm asking, because sometimes we do this really bizarre thing where we convolute ethnicity to religion or a faith or a following, which is the most strangest thing to do, isn't it?
Yeah. No, well, if you look at the teachings of most world religions, it's bizarre, without doubt. But it is interesting that, my legal name is Shaunaka Rishi. So it's maybe even more bizarre. So sometimes I get invited by a university in India, and I'll go and I'll walk out, they'll introduce me, and everyone looks at me. Because and it's an interesting thing for them, but it's not an issue for me personally because I don't care, because I just live in a different way of thinking. I have accepted this idea that we're not these bodies. We're just inhabiting these bodies for a certain length of time. I'm not a human being looking for a spiritual experience. I'm a spiritual being having a human experience.
Yeah.
So that's a Christian quote, but it works very well with Vedanta, and I think like that. So if I do something silly, I can just put it down to being Irish, and I'll get away with it. but but otherwise, it's not an issue. And so I'll go to India, I'll go to America, I'll go to Europe, and I'll give a talk as Shaunaka Rishi does. I'll represent the tradition. I'll do it as intelligently, as sympathetically, as broadly as I can. And people don't have a problem with it after the first minute.
Yeah.
Because knowledge in itself is a passport. If you actually know what you're talking about, and more than know what you talk about, if you embody what you talk about, then people get it. So you're connecting with them intellectually, but also at a certain level you're connecting heart to heart. Because if we talk about love, if we talk about virtues like humility, compassion, tolerance, these are things you see in people. They're not things you can talk about a lot. There's something you experience. So you have to be able to, and if you live like that, then ethnicity is not an issue. And so interestingly, I've never had a problem with this, from a racial point of view. Someone pointing out that, we have to listen to these white people again, it's more colonialism and all that kind of stuff. But they don't get that impression because it's not what I'm talking about, and it's not what I'm representing, and it's not who I am. And that transcends, if we think more spiritually, then the atmosphere is more spiritual, and that does transcend it.
Yeah, absolutely. Question then, I know that there's been a lot of semantics in the way that people are using identity politics, and one of the words that have been coming through the UK, for example, amongst other countries, is the word Hinduphobia. And I'm hoping that you can kind of give me an understanding of, well, what does that actually mean? Because surely you can't be phobic of a philosophy.
Well, so it's interesting. I hardly meet anyone who understands what Hinduism is. So it'd be very difficult to understand why they're afraid of it. It is a difficult tradition to understand because it's so different in its ways of thinking. It doesn't conform to the ideas of the Abrahamic traditions, Islam and Christianity and Judaism. There's no founder, there's no book, there's no church. So, when you say belief, it's not a word that means very much. It's based on knowledge. I mean, I might believe there's an elephant behind me, but never look around to find out. Knowledge is that I look around and I find out and I check it out. And, so belief doesn't mean, the word religion isn't found in any of the 15 major Indian languages. Certainly begin to talk about it, from a global point of view. So and that's part of our work in Oxford is learning how to describe and make this tradition accessible. But it's only when it's accessible that you can decide whether you're afraid of it or whether you love it or however you want to react to it. So I do think it's a word that's used in a political context. And there is a politicization of Hindu culture, like there is a politicization of every other culture. It's a fairly recent phenomena in Hinduism. When I say recent, like 130 years or something. It's understandable as to why it developed and how it's developed. But nationalism, which is its root in the 1920s in India, it is a German idea. It's a Western idea, and it didn't work out very well for Germany, and I'm not so sure it's working out very well in the world. And it could be in the next 100 years that nationalism becomes thing that people back away from. It's an interesting theory. It doesn't seem to be working. So, so to connect it with Hinduism could be considered, maybe it's an experiment. Let's see where it goes. Let's see how it develops. But as nationalism, it will be political in its expression.
Yeah.
So therefore, to use terms like that to invoke persecution, these are methods that are used in political discourse quite regularly. But you would all, any intelligent person looks for evidence, and the evidence has to be real. And there are cases for misunderstood, misrepresented, and knocked about simply because people don't understand them, or they're only looking at one aspect. And I totally understand that. And I totally understand historically why it's developed like that. And I think there's the blame for that, if you need to give blame, is on all sides. I think people have been miscommunicating about the subject for generations. So, I mean, classic. Someone asks a Hindu, "What's your Bible?" So what would your answer be, Raj, if you're answering that question?
If I were Hindu, but then what does it mean to be Hindu? I'll get quite philosophical for my personal faith. My expression of a Bible will be looking up at the stars and the soil beneath my feet. It's the experience of the earthly domain. That is the only way in which I could describe it to be. But then again, that is me coming off my travels. So Shaunaka, I think that's far more romantic than the answer that you're looking for, isn't it?
It's very romantic. I'm very impressively romantic. Well done. But I was looking. I mean, normally when Hindus get asked the question about the Bible, they're trying to satisfy the questioner.
Yeah.
And they're thinking the Bible's a book. What book? I'm thinking Hindu book. What's a Hindu book? Bhagavad Gita is usually the first one that comes out, and then they say that it's a chapter of a much bigger book, so it's not a book in itself. So you're already giving them misinformation, fake news, if you will, and the biggest problem is you're answering the question because the question is irrelevant. There isn't an equivalent. So you're really miscommunicating. You're setting up the basis for further miscommunication because you've answered the question. You haven't questioned the question. So if someone says, "What's your Bible?" says, "Well, there isn't an equivalent." There are many books of knowledge called Veda, and they're being added to. The compilation of these books hasn't stopped. There's so many commentaries on books and commentaries on commentaries. So this is a living tradition.
Yeah.
So, there are sacred books, but everyone chooses the one that enthuses them most, and they align with the one that. So ironically, answering the question, which is satisfying the inquirer, which is something that in Indian culture, you don't want to introduce a negative into a conversation for personal reasons. You don't want to negatively impact the person. So culturally, you want to answer the question. But by doing that, you're setting up a miscommunication that 200 years later is causing problems.
Which is hence why we are where we are.
It's interesting. It's just very interesting.
How is it seen? Yeah. Because as a belief, how would you describe Hinduism in a way that satisfies the average mindset like myself? It's not a religion. It's not a belief. It's not a way of life.
Well, you could say it's all those things. It's a civilization.
So then when people have this idea, then from that civilization, you had the Jains, the Buddhists, the Sikhs that came through, then it's a lot easier to understand why they say, well, it's come through a civilization of a philosophy from that region, which is why there is that generic areas of saying it is about asking the deeper questions from within and the exposure of experiences that the world then offers you from that.
Yes, and I think you look at the Vedas and the Upanishads and these books, the Hinduism, Buddhism, and some tribal religions, they are very much influenced by the thinking that preceded them.
Yeah.
So there is an intellectual tradition in India that has influenced all these traditions, and that's part of the civilization. But the civilization has a philosophical basis, and they're all reacting to that philosophy, or those philosophies, interestingly, positively and negatively, and developing their own philosophical perspectives. And that's how philosophy and religion have developed on the subcontinent. It's continually developing. It hasn't stopped developing. It's dynamic, which is very unusual.
Yeah.
It's not the Western model. It's a very different model. And that's why it's difficult for people to understand. It's so dynamic. And then they bump into Muslims, and all of a sudden they take some Muslim things as well. Why? Well, they're very interesting. And they conform to these principles. So why not? The Buddha refused to talk about God and refused to talk about the Vedas. But the principles behind his tradition, the philosophical approach, is very similar. He has borrowed from them. There's, without doubt. Can you call it Hindu? I don't think you can call it Hindu. It's his thing. Jainism, culturally, they're an awful lot. So philosophy and religion in a Western context are very distinct. Philosophy faculties and theology faculties, in some cases, don't even talk to each other. It's just don't. But in India, philosophy and religion have always been umbilically linked. It's like your head and your heart. You don't chop your head off because your heart doesn't like it. It doesn't make sense. These are integral to the whole. So good thinking is important. So if I'm in that civilization, I seek, and some other person, I have no idea where they're coming from, but I will ask the same question: how do you deal with suffering? Because that's an intelligent question to ask intelligent people, and they'll all have an interesting answer that we can all talk about. And that process is called Vada. It's a recognized discursive process where philosophers and thinkers come together and discuss big issues, meta issues. Is there a God? Is there not a God? What is this world? How do you approach this world? How do you live in this world? How do you live in this world if you think there's a God? How do you approach suffering? How do you approach happiness? What is happiness? Is it spiritual? Is it temporal? How do you deal with drugs? All that kind of stuff. Any question you talk to intelligent people, because in India, there wasn't one church, there wasn't one scripture, there wasn't one teacher. So everyone you met, I'm in Tamil Nadu and I meet someone from Gujarat, and I say, who's your guru? And he says, Akila Lokesh Rasamalai Vishnu Swami. I don't know who he's talking about. I don't even understand the language. And his cuisine, he eats dokla. What's dokla? So they're completely different cultures with completely different languages. So how do you begin to talk? Well, you talk about the common issues.
Yeah.
So everyone you meet is of a different religion. If I walk into any room, philosophy in Sanskrit is darshan, which means to see. It's how you see. But if I walk into a room and there are 10 Hindus, and we're all going to sit down and have a chat, well, I understand immediately there are 10 ways of seeing in that room. Because everyone's looking at everything from a different perspective. Everyone's got a different educational background, cultural background, family background, philosophical background, religious background, even though we're all ourselves Hindu. So there are 10 religions in that room. And there are as many religions as there are people on the planet. That's just a given in Indian intellectual thought. So therefore you have to dialogue with others. And that means that when you make that kind of Hinduism, that kind of intellectual rigor, if you take that and you make it nationalistic, then you're beginning to limit it, maybe.
Yeah.
That you can only talk to people from this country, and they happen to have a certain type of skin color. So at what point do you stop listening to Goras who say that they're Hindu?
Yeah.
Because if you talk nationalism, well, I'm obviously going to be an Irish nationalist then, aren't I?
Yeah.
Does that just create a barrier? Is that helpful?
Which in itself goes against the deeper philosophy that this is about the soul. It's about a earthly human experience. And that's where the conundrum exists. I think the fact that you took that level of pursuit to say, let me take a deep dive into this idea and understand it from all the different perspectives, rather than just being born into an idea and just adopting it. It makes a difference, and maybe that's what we need to be doing more so as society, whereby the concepts that govern our lives are the the areas that we need to provide as much critical thought towards. Otherwise, we're just simply existing
Yes.
under a vacuum of an idea that we have no understanding of, and it controls every single element of our lives. God, this has been such a deep dive conversation, hasn't it? If people want to find out more about the work that you've been doing, if they want to find out more about the center, where do they go? How can they get in touch with you?
Well, it's Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. Google
Aptly
it.
named. Aptly named.
Yeah, Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. Google it. I think we're the whole first page. And you'll find our website, you'll find our publications, you'll find our research projects, and also online courses. So we have about 44 online courses for anyone and everyone. You don't have to come to Oxford, you don't have to be a scholar. They're just introductory courses to Hinduism from every, like yoga, tantra, scriptures, whatever, temples, music. So yeah, so there's a lot to discuss.
Brilliant. Shaunaka, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, Rajan. Thank you very much.